Imagine waking up one morning, not to the gentle touch of a loved one or the excitement of a new day, but to the cold reality that your entire life has been decided for you by strangers, by contracts, by the unyielding grip of society. You are no longer a child, but commodity, a pawn in a game far bigger than yourself. This was the grim fate of many in the Middle Ages, where marriage was less about love and more about survival, power, and control. If you think modern dating is complicated, fraught with ghosting and heartbreak, try living in a world where your father could sell you off before you even learned to walk, where your wedding night was a public spectacle, and where childbirth was a gamble with death as the dealer. Welcome to the dark reality of medieval marriage. A world where "till death do us part" was less a romantic vow and more a brutal timeline etched in blood, pain, and legal chains. This isn't a story of fairy tale castles or chivalrous knights. It's a tale of child brides, ruthless contracts, and society that saw women as property and marriage as a business transaction. By the end of this journey, you might find yourself grateful for the freedom to swipe left or right, to choose your partner, and to dream of love that doesn't come with a price tag or a death sentence. Let's start at the beginning, the arrangement. Unlike today, where dating apps and chance encounters might lead to love, medieval marriages were meticulously planned deals, often sealed when the bride was barely more than a toddler. Take Margaret Beaufort, for example, a girl born into privilege but trapped by it. At the tender age of 6, she was married off to John Diol, not out of love, but as a strategic move to secure her family's wealth and influence. Margaret didn't even understand what was happening. She was too young to grasp the weight of the contract that bound her. 3 years later, political tides shifted, and her marriage was dissolved, only for her to be sold again, this time to a man twice her age. This wasn't an isolated incident. Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France, was married to King Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. Her dowry? Dolls and miniature silver furniture, a chilling reminder of her childhood stolen by political ambition. The marriage contract explicitly stated that the union couldn't be consummated until she turned 12, a concession even medieval society found extreme. But these weren't mistakes or abuses of love gone wrong. They were calculated moves in a ruthless game where children were assets and marriage was a currency. Why such cruelty? Because in a world ravaged by wars, plagues, and political upheaval, families needed to secure their fortunes and alliances quickly. A daughter with land or titles was a prize, a lottery ticket that could either elevate a family's status or destroy it if left unclaimed. Parents, far from being monsters, were survivors playing the only game they knew, one where the stakes were life, death, and legacy. But what about the wedding night? You might imagine a private, intimate moment shared between two people beginning their life together. In the Middle Ages, it was anything but. Picture this. After the feast, your friends, family, and even strangers escort you to your bedroom. Not to give you privacy, but to witness the beginning of your new life. Women would help the bride undress and prepare for the night ahead, offering advice that was less comforting and more like a grim warning. Men would do the same for the groom. Then, the couple would be brought together in front of an audience, sometimes with a priest blessing the bed for fertility. This public bedding ceremony was more than tradition. It was a legal necessity. Consummation made the marriage official, binding families together and securing political alliances. Without it, marriages could be annulled and fortunes lost. In some cases, witnesses would wait outside the bed curtains, expecting proof that the union was consummated. Imagine the pressure, the humiliation, and the fear, especially for young brides barely entering puberty. Childbirth, then, was the next cruel chapter. Far from the joyous event we often imagine, it was a deadly gamble. Roughly 1 in 3 women died during childbirth or from complications shortly after. Medical knowledge was primitive at best, and practices like bloodletting during labor often worsened the situation. Noble women, expected to produce heirs continuously, faced repeated pregnancies that left many sterile or permanently damaged. The story of Margaret Beaufort's traumatic first childbirth, which left her sterile for life, was sadly not unique. And if you survived childbirth, the nightmare didn't end. Medieval marriage laws gave husbands terrifying power over their wives. Under the doctrine of reasonable chastisement, husbands could legally beat their wives for any behavior they deemed inappropriate, with the only limit being the thickness of the stick used. Worse still, husbands could imprison or even kill their wives with little legal consequence. Henry VIII, infamous for his 6 marriages, used these laws to have wives executed when they failed to produce male heirs or fell out of favor. Divorce was nearly impossible, controlled by the church and requiring humiliating public examinations to prove non-consummation or other grounds. Women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. They couldn't own property, sign contracts, or testify in court without permission. Many women were trapped in abusive marriages with no hope of escape. Financially, marriage was a minefield. Dowries could bankrupt families, sometimes costing the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. The bride's family paid to secure an alliance, but once married, the bride's property and dowry legally belonged to her husband. Widows often lost everything when their husbands died, forcing many to remarry quickly for survival. Some women became serial wives, navigating a grim cycle of marriage, widowhood, and remarriage just to stay alive. Despite all this, people kept marrying. Death was a constant companion, and marriage was a practical necessity for survival and alliance building. The average medieval marriage lasted only 15 to 20 years, often ending with the death of one spouse. Widows and widowers remarried quickly, sometimes within weeks, because being single was a social and economic death sentence. So, when medieval couples promised till death do us part, they weren't being romantic. They were being brutally realistic. Death was the only reliable escape from a marriage that was often a nightmare from start to finish. As you reflect on this dark reality, remember that modern dating, with all its flaws, is a luxury our ancestors could never have imagined. The freedom to choose to love and to build a life with someone on your own terms is a hard-won privilege. And sometimes the best way to appreciate what you have is to look back at just how much worse things used to be. Now that we've peeled back the curtain on the grim realities of medieval marriage, it's time to dive deeper into the social and legal frameworks that made this system so brutal, and why it persisted for centuries despite its devastating impact on countless lives. First, let's talk about the role of law and religion in shaping medieval marriage. Unlike today, where marriage is often seen as a personal, emotional commitment, in the Middle Ages it was primarily a legal and economic contract. The Catholic Church held immense power over marriage, controlling who could marry whom, when, and under what conditions. But this control was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Church's involvement gave marriage a sacred status, but on the other, it made divorce nearly impossible. Annulments were rare and required proving that the marriage was invalid from the start, often through humiliating and invasive investigations. This meant that once a marriage was consummated, it was legally binding for life, and because the Church's rules were strict, women had very little recourse if their husbands were abusive or neglectful. The law didn't protect them. It protected the institution of marriage and the transfer of property and power that came with it. The doctrine of coverture further stripped married women of their legal identities. Under coverture, a wife's legal rights were subsumed by her husband's. She couldn't own property independently, and her contracts, or even represent herself in court. In essence, she became her husband's property, legally invisible as an individual. This legal framework made it nearly impossible for women to escape abusive marriages or protect their own interests. But why was this system so harsh, especially toward women? The answer lies in the economic and political realities of the time. Land was power, and marriage was the primary way to transfer land and secure alliances. Families, especially noble ones, viewed daughters as assets to be traded in the marriage market. A well-arranged marriage could elevate a family status, secure peace between rival factions, or consolidate wealth. Conversely, a poorly arranged marriage, or worse, an unmarried daughter, could spell financial ruin or social disgrace. This transactional view of marriage meant that love, compatibility, and personal happiness were luxuries few could afford. Instead, marriages were carefully negotiated deals, often involving massive dowries and complex contracts. The dowry was a bride's family's investment in the marriage, sometimes amounting to the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Families would go into debt to provide a dowry, hoping to secure a powerful alliance. But once the marriage was sealed, the dowry became the husband's property, and the bride's family had little control over how their daughter would be treated. The pressure on women to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was immense. Noble women were expected to bear children continuously, often starting in their early teens. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death, and many women didn't survive the ordeal. Those who did were often left with permanent physical damage, chronic pain, or infertility. The emotional toll was equally devastating, as women were blamed for infertility or the failure to produce sons, despite modern science showing that male fertility issues are just as common. The stories of women like Margaret Beaufort and Isabella Valois are heartbreaking, but not unique. Many women face similar fates, trapped in cycles of marriage, childbirth, and widowhood. Widows, in particular, face precarious futures. Without a husband, a woman's social and economic status plummeted. Many widows remarried quickly, sometimes within weeks, not out of love but necessity. Others were forced into convents, not by religious calling, but as a last resort to avoid poverty and starvation. The legal system also gave husbands terrifying powers over their wives. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement allowed husbands to physically discipline their wives for any behavior they deemed inappropriate. The only limit was the thickness of the stick used, a chillingly arbitrary standard. There are documented cases of husbands legally beating their wives with sticks no thicker than their thumbs and facing no consequences. This legal sanction of domestic violence was a stark reminder of the absolute control husbands wielded. Even worse, husbands could imprison or kill their wives with little fear of legal repercussions. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason were often fabricated to justify extreme punishments. The infamous case of Henry VIII illustrates this grim reality. His wives and Boleyn and Catherine Howard were executed on dubious charges, but these acts were perfectly legal under medieval law. Adultery was considered treason because it threatened the royal succession, and the penalty was death. Henry VIII's actions were not aberrations, but the logical extremes of a legal system designed to give husbands absolute power. Despite these horrors, medieval people didn't reject marriage. Why? Because marriage was essential for survival. Being unmarried was socially and economically dangerous, especially for women. Single women had few rights, limited means of support, and were often ostracized. Marriage provided protection, status, and a place in society, even if it came at a terrible cost. The average medieval marriage lasted only 15 to 20 years, often ending with the death of one spouse. Wars, plagues, and poor medical knowledge meant that death was a constant companion. The Black Death, which wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, devastated families and forced rapid remarriages. Widows and widowers often remarried within months or even weeks, not out of choice but necessity. This revolving door of marriage created complex family dynamics. Children might have multiple half-siblings and step-siblings from their parents' previous marriages. Inheritance disputes and shifting alliances were common, and medieval record-keepers had to become experts at tracking these tangled family trees. The psychological impact of this constant loss and instability was profound. Medieval people learned not to get too attached to their spouses, because death was always looming. Marriage was about survival and alliance building, not emotional connection. Love was a luxury few could afford when life was so precarious. Yet, despite all this, people kept marrying and having children. They endured the public bedding ceremonies, the brutal childbirths, and the legal oppression because the alternative, being alone in a harsh, unforgiving world, was far worse. So, when medieval couples promised till death do us part, they weren't being romantic. They were being brutally realistic. Death was the only reliable escape from a marriage that was often a nightmare from start to finish. As we reflect on this dark reality, it's important to remember how far we've come. Modern relationships, with all their challenges, are built on freedoms and choices that medieval people could only dream of. The ability to choose your partner, to love freely, and to expect legal protections are hard-won privileges. And sometimes, the best way to appreciate what we have is to look back at just how much worse things used to be. Now that we explore the harsh legal and social realities of medieval marriage, let's turn our attention to the human stories behind the laws and customs, the lived experiences of those trapped in this unforgiving system. Because behind every contract, every dowry, and every public ceremony, there were real people enduring unimaginable hardships. Take, for example, The story of Margaret Beaufort, a noble woman whose life encapsulates the brutal cycle of medieval marriage. Sold off at the age of 6, married at 12, and pregnant within months, Margaret's childhood was stolen by the demands of her family's political ambitions. Her first childbirth was so traumatic that it left her sterile for life, a fate shared by many young brides forced into motherhood before their bodies were ready. Margaret's story is a stark reminder that medieval marriage was not just a social contract, but a physical and emotional ordeal. The pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was relentless. Noble women like Margaret were expected to bear child after child, often with little time to recover between pregnancies. The toll on their bodies was devastating. Many died young, and those who survived were often left with chronic pain, infertility, or permanent damage. But it wasn't just the physical dangers that made medieval marriage a nightmare. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being a child, sold into marriage, stripped of your identity, and thrust into a world where your worth was measured by your ability to produce heirs and secure alliances. The public bedding ceremonies, where your wedding night was a spectacle for all to see, were humiliating and invasive. The constant threat of violence from a husband who had legal rights to discipline or even kill you added a layer of fear that no modern relationship can compare to. And yet, despite these horrors, medieval women found ways to survive and even thrive within the system. Some, like Margaret, became savvy managers of their inheritances and marriages, using their limited power to secure wealth and influence. Others found strength in community, religion, or family networks that provided support in a harsh world. The stories of women like Isabella of Valois and Isabella of Aragon further illustrate the extremes of medieval marriage. Isabella of Valois was married at 6 to King Richard II of England, a union that was more political alliance than personal relationship. Her childhood was sacrificed to the demands of power, and her wedding night was a public event that marked the end of her innocence. Isabella of Aragon, on the other hand, died at 18 after prolonged and agonizing childbirth, a tragic reminder of the deadly risks young brides faced. These individual stories highlight the broader realities of medieval life, where marriage was a tool of power, control, and survival, often at the expense of personal happiness and health. But what about the man? While much of the focus is rightly on the suffering of women, it's important to understand that medieval marriage was a complex institution that affected everyone involved. Men, too, were bound by social expectations and legal obligations. They were expected to provide heirs, manage estates, and uphold family honor. Failure to do so could result in loss of status, wealth, or even life. However, men generally held far more power and freedom within marriage. They controlled property, legal rights, and social standing. Husbands could legally discipline their wives, control their movements, and make decisions on their behalf. This imbalance of power was a defining feature of medieval marriage and a source of much suffering for women. The economic aspect of marriage cannot be overstated. Dowries were not just gifts. They were essential financial transactions that could make or break families. The pressure to provide a substantial dowry often led families into debt, and the failure to do so could result in social ruin. For the bride, the dowry was both a blessing and a curse. It secured her marriage, but also tied her fate to her husband's family and fortunes. Inheritance laws further complicated matters. Property and titles typically passed through the male line, leaving widows vulnerable. Many widows found themselves dispossessed upon their husbands' deaths, forced to remarry quickly or face poverty. Some women became adept at navigating these treacherous waters, using remarriage and strategic alliances to maintain their status and security. The constant threat of death from war, disease, and childbirth meant that medieval families lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Marriages were often short-lived, and remarriage was common. This created complex family dynamics, with children growing up among half-siblings and step-parents, and inheritance disputes becoming a frequent source of conflict. Despite the grim realities, medieval marriage was also a foundation of society. It was a primary means of social organization, alliance building, and economic stability. Without it, survival would have been even more precarious. So, while the dark reality of medieval marriage is undeniable, it's also a story of resilience, adaptation, and the human spirit's capacity to endure. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the freedoms and choices we have today and reminds us of the importance of continuing to fight for equality and justice in relationships. As we reach the end of this journey through the dark reality of medieval marriage, it's important to reflect on the lasting impact of these historical practices and what they teach us about human resilience, societal change, and the value of personal freedom. Medieval marriage, with all its brutality and hardship, was a product of its time, a time when survival depended on alliances, property, and power rather than love or personal choice. The system was designed to maintain social order and economic stability, often at the expense of individual happiness and well-being. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of the system, their lives shaped by laws and customs that treated them as property and tools for family advancement. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, many medieval women found ways to assert their agency. Some became influential figures, managing estates, negotiating marriages, and wielding power behind scenes. Others found solace in faith, community, or the bonds of family. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to survive and sometimes even thrive. The legacy of medieval marriage laws and customs can still be felt today. While modern societies have made tremendous progress in gender equality and personal freedoms, echoes of these old systems linger in cultural attitudes, legal frameworks, and social expectations. Understanding this history is crucial for recognizing how far we've come and how much work remains to be done. It also challenges us to think critically about the institutions we take for granted. Marriage today is often idealized as a romantic union, but remains a legal and economic contract with real consequences. By examining the past, we can better understand the complexities of marriage and relationships in the present. So, what can we learn from the dark reality of medieval marriage? First, that personal freedom and choice are precious and hard-won. The ability to choose whom we marry, when, and under what circumstances, is a right that many before us were denied. Second, that legal and social systems profoundly shape our lives and relationships. Laws that protect or oppress can make all the difference in the quality of life and the ability to live with dignity. Finally, the stories of medieval marriage remind us of the importance of empathy and justice. Behind every historical fact and statistic are real people, women and men who lived, loved, suffered, and survived. Their experiences call on us to continue striving for a world where marriage and relationships are based on respect, equality, and genuine connection. As you think about the medieval marriage nightmare we've uncovered, take a moment to appreciate the freedoms you enjoy today. The ability to say no, to walk away, to seek happiness on your own terms is a gift that history has taught us to cherish. And if this glimpse into the past has given you a new perspective on love, marriage, or the struggles of those who came before us, consider sharing this story. Because sometimes the best way to understand the present is to remember the past and to honor the resilience of those who endured so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark reality of marriage in the Middle Ages. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There's so much more history to uncover, and together we can keep learning from the past to build a better future. Until next time, remember, love may be complicated, but a far cry from the nightmare our ancestors faced. And that's something worth celebrating.